Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would like to continue on with our journey, our exploration through the films that can be found in this marvelous set, which is known as Pioneers of African American Cinema. This happens to be the Kino Classics North American release of this in Blu-ray format. And in such Blu-ray format, there are 5 discs in total. On the third of such discs, we have the work, the feature-length work, which is described as being from 1931 from filmmaker Oscar Micheaux. And the name of this work is The Exile. And my goodness, what an interesting sound feature film this is from this extraordinary filmmaker artist, Oscar Micheaux. I think the story or plot could be said to be revolving around the main character, the protagonist, who is this gentleman named John Baptiste. And he is an African-American gentleman who has a relationship with another African-American woman who is Edith in Chicago. And Edith has recently come into some wealthy property, and that makes her a very wealthy woman, and also it gives her a certain status in society, and she plans to apply both of those in order to fulfill her plans of an economic nature, to, in essence, use that property to establish and run a social nightclub where there would be lots of song and dance, a lot of wining and dining, a lot of gambling and drink, a real quote-unquote den of sin from a certain perspective, a certain point of view, which is the point of view, in fact, that John Baptiste, the hero, the main protagonist of this film, seems to espouse, because it seems to be one of the reasons that the relationship between Edith and John Baptiste is souring. At the same time, we have this story that is originating in the Chicago environment, and then the film then turns to South Dakota, which is depicted as being the rural homestead environment where John Baptiste goes, where he tries to make a living off the land and living life as a homesteader with his own property and living in this rural landscape with nature, as it were. He also has a certain set of people that he meets in this particular environment of the rural homestead. For example, the characters of Jack Stewart and his daughter, Agnes. Now, Jack Stewart is also a homesteader and also a landowner, and he is a white man, and he has a daughter, Agnes, and there is already an attraction between the young woman, Agnes, and John Baptiste. And this therefore forms one of many crucial themes and thematic discussions and concerns that are interwoven and embedded within the very cinematic fabric of the film The Exile. Which is the theme of the idea of a type of psychological perspective, or a examination, or the idea or perception of oneself relating to the notion or the concept of miscegenation, or to be even more specific, anti-miscegenation, because we have to remember that in this time there were still anti-miscegenation laws that were in effect. thus prohibiting by law, say, the marriage union between people who are of different race or race backgrounds. And so John Baptiste, who is an African-American man, meets Agnes, and he thinks that Agnes is a young white woman. And so therefore, from his vantage point and his understanding, his racial background is different than the racial background of Agnes. And so therefore, due to the anti-miscegenation situation, he perceives it impossible for them to fulfill their mutual attraction or to consummate their relationship. And so that forces him back from South Dakota, from the homestead, back to Chicago, and back to the relationship that he had with Edith in Chicago. And by this time, she has already established her nightclub, and further intrigue and plot twists and developments occur to the final conclusion of this film, which is the EXILE. And so already I've mentioned one of the core thematic concerns of this, which is the role of miscegenation, or more specifically, the impact of anti-miscegenation laws or anti-miscegenation attitudes towards the characters here, and specifically Jean-Baptiste, because we understand that he takes this particular situation and internalizes it on a psychological and emotional level to the point where he takes it as a given that any type of relationship between him and Agnes, who, as I say, whom he perceives as being a white woman, any relationship between him and her would be impossible during this time in this particular society at this time. This is, of course, a very important example of the many thematic concerns that are part of Oscar Micheaux's cinema overall, and most definitely as expressed in this film, The Exile. So first off, as I mentioned, we have the thematic discussion of anti-miscegenation laws and also the concept or the social implications of anti-miscegenation that are manifesting themselves in the way in which Jean-Baptiste perceives his relationship with Agnes to be one that is not possible in terms of some kind of union or a relationship between them on an intimate, personal, and emotional level. And so we have the idea of the law or the racist aspects of these particular imposed laws creating or otherwise engendering a type of emotional consequence on these particular characters, and perhaps by extension it might suggest a way in which Jean-Baptiste views himself as a person, as a human being that has limitations that are quite unfair and unjust, of course, but still limitations on what it is he is able to do and with whom he is able to meet and fall in love and have relationships with. So this is one of the very key aspects of this film, which we have seen here and also in past Micheaux works like, say, Symbol of the Unconquered or Within Our Gates. So this is one very important theme. Related to this, we have the ways in which people and characters are perceiving themselves and viewing themselves in terms of their own self-worth. And this idea of self-viewing, self-worth, self-perception is linked very closely with how these people outwardly express their views on race. And this is manifested in, I think, a number of very key examples in this film, The Exile. So first we have the idea of people who are, say, viewed in terms of the tone of their skin color. And this is referred to, for example, as light tone skin color or darker skin tones, or light skin tone or darker skin tone. And sometimes what happens is we have African American characters who, say, have a light skin tone, who might be seen by other characters to be not African American in terms of race, but in fact they might be thought of as being white. And so that leads to some very complex and somewhat precipitous terrain in terms of race relations externally, but also internally in terms of how certain characters view themselves. And this can be a type of positive depiction or negative depiction, depending on the specific circumstances of that particular character. But in any event, what we have here in the Exile is we have this discussion of light skin tone and dark skin tone, and people or characters who are perceived as being one race, but in fact are indeed another race, and how that affects their overall, say, goals or ambitions or viewpoints about themselves and their people around them. Case in point, the character of Agnes, who is one of the love interests of Jean-Baptiste. And I mentioned before how Jean-Baptiste believes or perceives her as being a white woman, and this is due to perhaps her appearance and also the fact that he knows her father, who is a white man. But we come to understand and realize that based on the information provided to her by her father, that her mother was an African American woman. And so that leads to a number of interesting questions and also situations that result from that revelation of information. So, of course, directly it has implications on the plot in terms of the relationship possibilities in the context of anti-miscegenation laws. It has certain plot implications vis-a-vis the relationship between Jean-Baptiste and Agnes on the one hand. So that's one thing. But also, in terms of a sort of social thematic concern, we have the way in which, for instance, this information about the true racial identity of a character like Agnes, how that affects her emotionally and psychologically. Does it affect her in a positive way, or does it affect her in a negative way? And we've seen in past works by Micheaux, for example, most strikingly perhaps in The Symbol of the Unconquered, how information about one's or certain characters who know of the information of their true racial background deal with it in certain ways. And maybe in that film, certain characters dealt with it in a negative way, trying to hide it, trying to, what's the phrase, pass as white in order to avoid or evade any type of racial prejudice against them, but also turning that prejudice that would otherwise be directed towards African Americans, but turning it against them as well. So people who are passing, or certain characters in that film who are passing as white, tended to turn their frustration and anger outward in a very almost quite a complicated and quite shocking manner. So that is one example where it could be said to be a type of negative depiction. But it's not always negative, and perhaps case in point is a character like Agnes in this film, The Exile. And so when you watch the film, consider her situation and how she interprets or how she takes this information about her racial background and identity. Does she use it in a positive manner or a negative manner? Does she seem to express herself in a different way in psychological or emotional terms? Is she more guarded? Is she disturbed by this information? Or does she feel somewhat differently? Does she feel, in fact, liberated? Or does she feel a sense of freedom in terms of the truth that has been given to her? And so, based on that interpretation, I think we can see the possibilities in terms of Agnes and how the the truth about her racial background, which granted was probably not known to her and also to others, based in part on what was or wasn't told to her directly by her father, also based on her appearance and the tone of her skin. And so in those ways, we have the example of Oscar Micheaux in this film, The Exile, exploring or dealing with this notion of the light skin tone and the darker skin tone, and how that is very much a direct part of the discussion of racial relations and prejudice, racially based prejudice. And so this is a very key concern in the world of Oscar Micheaux's cinema, and it's definitely the case here in the film The Exile. And to take that a little bit further, that theme, I think, is made even further complex in this film The Exile by means of, say, other characters that are maybe just we don't meet directly, or that are, say, secondary characters that are mentioned briefly or that appear briefly. So they aren't necessarily the primary focus of the plot itself, but I think they still figure in very directly and quite consequently to this theme, or to this thematic concern and discussion about racial relations and racial identity. Excuse me. So, for example, I mentioned the information about Agnes's mother and the true racial identity and the racial background of Agnes because of the racial background of her mother. And so what this leads to, it leads to a certain number of questions, which is, well, it leads to the question of how Agnes will respond and react to this revelation of information. Will it be a somewhat positive reaction or a somewhat negative reaction? And also, we have to question, or we have to wonder, what the relationship dynamic was between father and mother. And was the mother someone we haven't met or we don't meet in the film, but what was the situation of the mother and how she was living in society at the time? Was she outwardly acknowledging her racial background and identity, or was she hiding it in favor of, say, trying to pass as white? And those questions I don't think are directly addressed in this film, but they are part of the discussion of these characters as we see them in Oscar Micheaux's cinematic world and cinematic landscape. And so, and though the answers to the questions have, I think, they have very important or potentially important consequence to the daily lives and the daily living habits and the emotional states of mind of the characters in question, the father and the mother, and thus the child, Agnes. So this is a very important concern in the world of Oscar Micheaux, and that's one example. Another example in this department is the character of Bill Prescott, who is one of the associates or another homesteader in this particular community of South Dakota who knows Jack Stewart, who is Agnes's father. And apparently maybe he has an interest in Agnes himself. We're not sure exactly, but what's interesting about this is the character of Bill Prescott, expresses racially prejudicial attitudes towards African Americans, and it's very obvious, and it's quite shocking, and it's very direct. And this provides the opportunity in a very key scene for the father of Agnes, Jack, to counter that type of racist attitude on the part of Bill Prescott. So what's interesting about this particular moment in the film The Exile, though, is the character of Bill Prescott, who, as I say, is expressing these racist attitudes in the types of remarks that he is making. He is described in the materials as being a character being portrayed by an African-American actor. And so this is, when one sees the scene, there is a type of how should I put it? There is a confusion that arises because is this character of Bill Prescott expressing these racist attitudes because he is, say, trying himself to pass as white, but is internalizing a type of racial hatred in a way that turns into his own hatred towards African Americans? And so is it that type of situation which we, as I say, have seen in past Micheaux works, most strikingly in one of the characters in The Symbol of the Unconquered? Is this one of those situations? It is a very shocking and thought-provoking and quite confusing point, but it's confusing, and I think in a purposeful way, and therefore this is yet another example where Oscar Micheaux is blurring the color line, again to borrow Charles Musser's phrase, and really challenging us into trying to engage with this material and really question our own perceptions, our own viewpoints, and really try to get at the heart of the emotional context, the way in which these characters are looking at themselves and how their outward expressions may, in a direct or indirect way, be relevant to their own inward sensibilities. And so, and this is tied in directly with the notion of race and racial identity and self-identity. And that self-identity is linked with how one perceives oneself and also how the outside world perceives you. And the perception is based on the skin color or the complexion or tone. And so this is, again, this is something that we've seen in Oscar Micheaux's films in a very striking manner, and it's still prevalent and still striking in the sound film, The Exile. And also, to continue on with other themes that are relevant in this film, we have the character of Edith, who is, we are told at the very outset, is a character who has come into a certain amount of wealth and this property, this real property, because the owners, the heirs to the property, we are told in a title card at the very start of the film, we are told were scared off because of what they saw as the northern migration of African Americans into Chicago. And we understand too from this title card that this was due to the labor shortage that came about as a result of of World War I, the World War. And so the labor shortage created one of the primary reasons for what's known as the northern migration, the migration of African Americans from the South into the North in order to fill that labor shortage. Well, what this also reveals, and we see this in this title card at the very beginning, again, we see that these racist attitudes are prevalent not just in the South but also in the North at this time, because we are told in this title card that the heirs to the house were scared off by the northern migration and the African Americans that came into the community. What is this community? This is Chicago. This is the place where Edith is, and so this is also a point that, for instance, certain scholars and film historians like Jacqueline Juba Stewart, and also a co-curator of this particular set, has pointed out in terms of the one of the key thematic points that are often raised in the cinema of this time, the 1920s and the early 1930s. And so we see it here in The Exile at the very beginning, and it's very important in setting up Edith and the reason by which she ends up becoming a very wealthy woman indeed. So this is very important. Also, a very key theme in this film is going back to the idea of the homestead, right? Because remember, the main character of Jean-Baptiste is himself a homesteader, and this is a work that is based upon the Conquest and also elements of the other works by Micheaux that are dealing with the rural life homestead, and making one's life in an independent way. And this forms a type of maybe indirect type of juxtaposition between the rural life on the one hand is depicted in this film, and then the urban life on the other hand. And we see the urban life expressed in characters like Edith, and also later we see the character of Jango, and we see the club that's set up, and John Baptiste has a certain set of reservations against this club, and the idea that the club seems to represent immoral acts, gambling, drink, and other examples of sin, etc. So already the juxtaposition is set up where the rural life, the homestead, is the idyllic. It's expressed as being the place where John Baptiste is able to find certain elements of freedom and independence, whereas the urban life is expressed in this nightclub situation, and Edith, the character, is seen as perhaps being corrupt and immoral on the other hand. However, once again, like with many other aspects, in the hands of Oscar Micheaux, nothing is concretely simple. Things often get a little bit complicated. So on the one hand, this idyllic depiction of the rural homestead life is not wholly idyllic because of, say, emerging racist attitudes that exist even in that particular rural setting. And I'll draw your attention once again to the character of Bill Prescott, who is in the rural environment scenes of the film. So that tends to complicate the otherwise idyllic, picturesque depiction of that particular component of the film. The opposite is true for the urban depictions here. So generally speaking, one can say that the urban storylines are maybe set somewhat negatively. There is a sense of the immoral activity, the villains of the piece, of the film. Edith perhaps might be considered a villain as well, but even in that depiction, there are a number of positive aspects that are depicted in the urban setting scenes. For example, this is a sound film by Oscar Micheaux, and so this provides the opportunity for him to take the time to stop and show us the song and dance routines. And there are some really great ones. There are some great dance routines here that are very exciting, very fresh, very energetic. And so I think those form examples of how the urban or the city life scenes aren't wholly, say, immoral, but in fact they are expressing this lovely attitude of art and song and dance that is very catchy, very fun, and it's very energetic. And there's, I think it's given this room and space to breathe and to be captured on film. So there is a sense of a positive depiction of this particular culture or community. The city or urban community, as it were, even though the plot might suggest a somewhat immoral type of perspective on the part of the filmmakers. But even in that way, a character like Edith is not a type of a two-dimensional villain. On the contrary, she is herself a human being. She has reasons for feeling scorned and betrayed. She has reasons for wanting to establish her own, say, nightclub, and it's due to a feeling of wanting to have a sense of her independence, right? After all, she is described at the very outset as having been working as a maid all the way until she came into this large sum of money, or this large property, as it were. And so she wants to, in essence, stake out her own claim to independence, which is very much like what John Baptiste wants to do and the other people on the homestead want to do in the homesteader experience. So in that way, they are part of the same dynamic or impulse towards a feeling of independence, both economically and also emotionally, perhaps, as well. So this is therefore to say that even those depictions form a sense of a complex or nuanced and subtle representation. And so even in that way, I think we can see Oscar Micheaux not necessarily giving us a wholly positive or wholly negative viewpoint, but rather a nuanced depiction of the city life and the rural life that I think is very thought-provoking and very much part of why this film is so successful in my view. And so in this way, of course, this film is carrying on the tradition and legacy of Oscar Micheaux cinema, because each of these themes is a theme that we have seen discussed in one degree or another in past Micheaux works. So this therefore fits in very, very nicely into the filmography of Micheaux up to now, at least that which survives, of course, because a number of his works are unfortunately not surviving. Now, I should say also that this is a sound film. It is described in the materials that are included with the set as being the earliest surviving sound film from an African-American filmmaker, that is Oscar Micheaux. So in that way, it is very historic, very significant, and I think it's linked also with another short film by Oscar Micheaux, and it's also a sound work called The Dark Town Review. In any event, we have here the feature-length sound work from Micheaux. Now, although there are ways in which, as I tried to describe, there are ways in which this film can be said to be linked to past Micheaux works, there are also ways in which this film is distinct from those works, and I think it's primarily due to the sound elements and the way in which it's focusing in on a lot of the song and dance numbers, and there's a way in which the characters are framed and they are staged and they are positioned, and the way that they deliver dialogue, and this might be seen by some as being a weakness of the film. In other words, maybe it might be seen by some as being a criticism of the film, that the way in which some of the scenes are staged, the characters are delivering dialogue, it might be seen as being a bit stiff or a bit stagey, and not at all dynamic, and perhaps some might go further to say that that is suggestive of the fact that this is a very, very poorly put together work. And if you feel that way about this film, The Exile, that's completely okay, and I understand that, because it might be seen, yes, in terms of say, production values, to not necessarily be a film that has the highest, most polished sense of production values. I completely get that. And that is certainly true also of other works by Oscar Micheaux going forward in the sound era. And we will talk about those, especially when we get into disc 4 of the set. And so that's, I think, a very legitimate criticism to make. However, I do also want to emphasize that a work by Oscar Micheaux, and especially in the sound period, in my view, it's from when I watch an Oscar Micheaux film, I'm not looking necessarily for a film that has the best possible production value. I am always looking for, I guess I say at the start of this discussion, a film that is dealing with these thematic discussions in the context of these stories. And yes, of course, sometimes the stories are far-fetched. Sometimes they might be so over the top to be almost to the point of being ludicrous in terms of the sort of the overly dramatized nature of the coincidences and the character networking, etc. And I totally get that. But that's part of the charm too. That's part of the way, because there's an outrageousness in the cinema in the hands of Micheaux, also in the way that stories are developed. It's outrageous. It's meant to provoke. It's meant to get a response. It's meant to challenge the viewers, and indeed it does. And everything that Oscar Micheaux is showing in his sound works, such as The Exile, is meant to challenge and is meant to give you and give the viewers a type of opportunity for engagement and discussion in these themes. And indeed, even if the story or the way in which it's told might be not necessarily the most polished cinematic expression ever, still it is undeniable that his thematic concerns of a nature that I was trying to express earlier are vivid and sharp and very biting. There's a satirical edge to it. There is a real cunning type of intelligence to all of these thematic discussions. And so in many ways, to watch an Oscar Micheaux film is to get a sense of that type of cunning intelligence expressed, and he does it even with limited means. He still manages to shock and to provoke and to elicit these types of responses and to cause conversations to happen. And that is certainly the case with this film, which I really, really enjoy, by the way. This is the sound film called The Exile. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.